example, who was a favorite of the West, despite the fact that he was unquestionably far more impressive, one of the most impressive of the leaders in Eastern Europe, you know, compared to such people as, let's say, Kadar in Hungary and so on, Gierek in Poland. So the idea of staying away from Moscow is the opposite policy. Now this has some very restrictive effects on American policy. For example, during the national movement in Croatia in 1971, Nixon was not very happy with the weakening of the Yugoslav Federation that was the side effect of the Prague movement. Nor was there any evidence to support the idea that the United States would be very helpful to various separatist movements in Yugoslavia, no matter what part of the country we're talking about. It was important to have the state as an organizational alternative to the Soviet camp, because repeatedly there were attempts to duplicate this experience. 56 in Hungary, 68 in Czechoslovakia, 81 in Poland, with various degrees of success and with various specific issues. So after the fall of Brankovic, the chance of Soviet control was somewhat diminished. It was somewhat diminished with the intervention in Czechoslovakia again, but it would rise occasionally when the Yugoslav state felt itself threatened specifically from the West. And this was this balance that was perpetually pursued. Of course, the fact that Tito was involved with it gave it particular poignancy. It was less successful with the chaps who followed him, who were by no means as elastic as he was.
We have one question. to much students. And the last question, the third Yugoslav.
Sorry, we really have that. Okay, very quickly. Why Yugoslavia collapsed in the absence of some sort of a common outside threat is one way of looking at it. I wrote an article immediately after the beginning of this collapse where I argued, and I think that this is still a valid argument, that without a communism, there probably would not have been the second Yugoslav state. And therefore, with the collapse of communism, you had the collapse of the second Yugoslav state. Now, I admit that this is a controversial argument. It's not necessarily in contradiction with what you have said. But the threat in 1990 was no longer from outside, it was from inside. And of course that has implications as well. As for this question of wartime losses, this is of course a very, very complicated story. I am not going to get into this numbers game, which of course is a minor industry, and of course a very contentious minor industry. But I think we can agree on one thing, and that is that the occupied Germans, Italians, what you can, are probably not responsible for the majority of the losses. That the majority of the losses are the consequence of internecine struggles, executions, liquidations that claimed very, very large numbers of the cost. Chris.
Please be brief in your question.
Okay, I have a couple of questions, but Professor, you will allow me later to ask you a couple of questions. One, I will just ask one. A couple of weeks ago, in one of the magazines, I read actually that famous historical novel, 1948, actually didn't at all happen in 1948. That in first May parade in Belgrade in 1949, actually dominating photo was Stalin's. And that actually Tito never said no, but Stalin said no to Tito. And that all after, what came after, was only Tito's propaganda.
Well, I recommend my book with Stalin against Tito, which makes that point, which is to say that Stalin broke with Tito and not the other way around, expecting, I should add, that it was sufficient. This is a quote from Khrushchev, to wiggle one's little finger and Tito would collapse. That's where Stalin made a big error. The Stalinist idea, which Lavrentiev presented to one of the members of the Yugoslav leadership in the early stages of the split, was we are going to prevail because our apparat is bigger than your apparat. We are bigger. They were bigger, but Tito used, of course, extreme repression, mobilization, nationalist arguments in order to secure his position, and Stalin did not do what he at one point actually planned, and that is an invasion. We know that he had a plan. Bela Kira told us about that, and it was a very simple plan from Hungary across the Drava, direct into Central Yugoslavia, Soviet army aided by Hungarian and Romanian units. But he didn't do it. One story is because of the Korean War. There might be other reasons.
Dr. Banac, you mentioned Bakali and the Kosovar